This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome, everyone. It's 8:35, so we're going to go ahead and get started, understanding that some folks may still be joining us over the next several minutes. Welcome to the 2021 Legislative Update and Advocacy event. I'm Katrina Knight, Executive Director of Good Shepherd and Chair of the Cape Fear Housing Coalition, your host. The Cape Fear Housing Coalition is a membership organization with the mission of strengthening the Cape Fear region by increasing access to affordable, safe, healthy housing. Our members hail from New Hanover, Brunswick, and Pender counties and include stakeholders from the lender, realtor, service provider, developer, and municipal government communities, as well as many others. We encourage you to join the coalition, if you haven't already, to support our continued education and advocacy around our deepening regional affordable housing crisis. So thank you for joining us today. We're sorry we can't have the usual breakfast and networking and in-person gathering, but we have some great speakers lined up who are being great sports about presenting to you remotely. Samuel Gunter of the North Carolina Housing Coalition will provide the outlook from Raleigh and DC. And then Cynthia Blue of the City of Greensboro will share with us about that community's 10-year housing plan, as well as the housing bond that will serve as an important tool generating affordable housing funds. We're going to hold questions for the Q&A at the end, but please go ahead and begin using the chat function as you think of questions. Forward those to us. We'll be gathering those throughout the conversation and returning to them at the end of our time together. So before introducing our first speaker, we'd like to acknowledge some of the elected officials who are joining us as special guests today. If we've overlooked anyone, please wave at us or use the chat box to introduce yourself to the group. But these are the folks who let us know that they plan to join us today. We have North Carolina House Representative Charlie Miller. From the town of Leland, Veronica Carter. Representing Wilmington City Council, Reverend Clifford Barnett and Kevin O'Grady. New Hanover County Commissioners Vice Chair Deb Hayes, Commissioners Jonathan Barfield and Rob Zappel. And from the New Hanover County School Board, Stephanie Adams. Thank you all for joining us today. On to our speakers. Samuel Gunter is Executive Director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition, having worked there since 2015. He currently chairs the Housing Recovery Support Function of the North Carolina State Disaster Recovery Task Force, is appointed to the North Carolina Interagency Council on Coordinating Homeless Programs, and sits on the Board of Directors of both Habitat for Humanity of North Carolina and the Council of Independent State Housing Associations. Samuel has a background in community development and public policy from his time at Habitat for Humanity of Wake County, AmeriCorps Vista, and the Peace Corps. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School. He's also a Baptist minister who has served churches in North Carolina and Texas. For our legislative update, welcome, Samuel.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Y'all, it is good to see everyone this morning. And as we just heard, I'm sad that we're not having breakfast together. I enjoy this every year, although it did mean that I didn't have to get up early to make the drive to make it there from Durham. And this morning, I don't know about y'all, but we have snow on the ground in Durham. We had about 3/4 of an inch, so our local economy is going to be shut down for a couple of days, and keep us in your prayers on that front. But it did mean I got to get my 2-year-old twins and my 5-year-old dressed up as soon as they woke up in snow clothes and go out and throw some snowballs at each other. So that's been my morning. It's great to see everyone. Y'all, 2020 was a year on the housing front and much broader, right? And I'm gonna table some of the much broader stuff. But there's a lot to talk about there, especially as it impacts housing. And here's where I want to start off this morning. I want to start off with just kind of charting the big arc of the events that happened as it relates to housing over the course of 2020. So we at the coalition, as many of you probably had some kind of strategic plan named taking advantage of 2020 and vision and all of that type of stuff. We had plans for 2020, y'all, and they didn't work out. We had seen back in 2019, at the beginning of the 2-year budgeting process that we have at the General Assembly, that we were struggling to get to a budget. General Assembly passed one, the governor vetoed it. There was a long, the House was able to overturn the veto in a spectacular fashion, and but the Senate was unable to. And so we didn't have a budget for the last 2 years. That had some pretty significant impact on housing for a couple of reasons that we'll get to. But as we were coming into 2021 and a short legislative session and looking at the political climate and seeing that some of our priorities were probably not going to be able to move in the short session, let's take a step back and start preparing for the long session that we are now in 2021. We formed a policy committee to start talking about the structure of our housing infrastructure in the state and how we wanted to think big about what we wanted to see as a state moving forward. The first meeting of that policy committee was the last day before we went under stay-at-home orders here in North Carolina. So that tells you how our year went. We immediately shifted our work to CARES Act advocacy in DC, working on making sure that there was housing money coming in. As soon as the housing money came in, there was a big question of how we were going to use it in the state. And so we shifted to working with some local governments as well as state government to figure out how we could use as much of that money as possible to help keep folks in their homes, knowing that we were seeing what we were going to see on the horizon was a massive wave of evictions and foreclosures were we not able to get some of the stuff in place. We had the state court system closed for a while, and then an eviction moratorium was put in place, which was then supplemented by a CDC eviction moratorium in DC. We had a big fight in the General Assembly over how we were going to deploy the rest of the CARES Act funding. We had worked on a bill that we'll talk about that didn't go through, but ended up becoming the building blocks of what would become the HOPE program that was managed out of the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. November was a big election. Obviously, there are massive consequences with the change in administration in Washington, D.C., as well as a new Congress. We also had 2 ballot measures, affordable housing bond measures on the ballot in November that passed. And then with a new Congress, a new relief package. And so there's a lot to go through, but that's kind of the arc. And where we're sitting right now, and we'll go through this in a little bit more detail, is a new White House that has been issuing some executive orders that impact those of us who work in housing. Today, after we finish, our new HUD secretary is going to be testifying and hopefully will get confirmed. And there is talk about another relief package in DC. And we're beginning a 2-year budgeting process in the state. So let's go ahead and switch the slide and start digging into some of this. So the CARES Act, which passed back at the beginning of COVID in 2020, included, the expanded unemployment insurance, the eviction moratorium, some of these stimulus payments, but then there were these housing resources. So we had an additional allotment of ESG funds, which are usually target homeless populations, extra community development block grant funds, and that was some of the work that we were doing with local governments, trying to use as much of that as possible for rental, mortgage, and utility payments. Added house choice voucher programs, but it's this coronavirus relief fund that states had some flexibility in what to do with it. Go ahead and switch the slide over. So you can see some of the coronavirus, the CDBG funds that came down. The details in this aren't particularly important, but part of the arc of last year was figuring out, okay, you passed this money, we don't quite know what the rules are yet, we got to figure out how to get it out the door quickly. It's coming in several tranches. The initial one came the way CDBG normally comes, where some going to entitlement districts and others going to the state for all the rest of the state that is not covered in that. And the state trying to figure out how to build the infrastructure for something that we don't normally do, which is help folks make rental payments at any kind of scale. And how do we do it effectively? right? That doesn't set up, okay, Greensboro has a system, but then the state has a system for a different county. And so that was some of what we were struggling to figure out how to do in the early days. Go ahead and flip the slides. So like I said, the courts closed. Cherry Beasley ordered them closed for a little bit, and then the governor issued a series of executive orders. One on utility disconnection, which has had some pretty significant impacts on local governments around. And then as we saw the CDC eviction moratorium come through, that there was a question of whether it applied, and our court system, depending on what district you were in, some folks were recognizing it, some judges weren't recognizing it, and regardless of whether the judges were recognizing it, folks had to sign an affidavit, and whether or not they knew about it, there was no requirement on the part of the court to let them know they were eligible for this thing. And so we had the governor affirming that, yes, this order applies to North Carolina back in March. Go ahead and flip the slides. Here are the pieces of the CDC eviction moratorium, which is still in place and just got extended by the Biden administration. And CDC right now, for those of you who are interested, seems to be welcoming comment on how the order can be improved. This was obviously highly controversial in some areas, particularly for landlords. And there were several legal challenges around the country of whether the CDC had the authority to do this at all. All of those legal challenges have been dismissed, and so it still stands. But what is clear, and I'll say this from our perspective, that I think one of the things that has become crystal clear in 2020, and this is something that we say on a regular basis every time we talk to elected officials, that housing, it sits at the center of all of our systems, right? Where you go to school, your access to employment, transportation, criminal justice, public safety, it sits in the middle of all of it, right? And where you live is so foundational and so important. But what we realized in 2020, which we knew before, right, is that housing is also public health. And if we're in a situation where you got a shelter at home, you need a home to shelter in. And for many of us, I've got little kids, right? And so not only before was our house important for determining where our schools are, what our school was, but now all of a sudden our homes are becoming our schools, right? And so the condition of that home, its affordability, all of these things are front of mind for a lot of folks who may not thought of it as in that way before. And so when we talk about this eviction moratorium, keeping folks in their homes became a very critical public policy priority early on. But, and we're going to see this around foreclosure protections and the forbearance options that were put in place for mortgage holders who were struggling to pay their mortgages, that preventing an eviction or preventing a foreclosure is a Band-Aid. And if you don't address the underlying problem, which is the inability to make that payment, it all falls apart right quick, right? And so these protections to keep folks in their homes need to be coupled with the rental assistance, the mortgage assistance, and so on. Go ahead and flip the slides. So in the General Assembly, there were a couple of things that happened. We had early on had worked with a couple of Democratic legislators to craft a bill that would direct some of that CARES Act funding toward rental and mortgage assistance. In between us helping craft that legislation and really over the weekend, and this has been sort of the story, that there's resources coming down, but the direction on how those resources can be used is shifting, and Treasury updates guidance and then sends out other guidance and so on. The guidance changed, and the way we had crafted it, it wouldn't work. And then we worked with Representative Soka, who is out of Cumberland County, Republican chair of the Finance Committee at the time, worked with him and with Representative Sane out of Lincoln County to craft House Bill 1200, which was a bipartisan bill, had an incredible amount of support, and it would have directed $200 million of that towards rental, utility, and mortgage assistance, as well as some administrative support for housing counseling agencies and legal service providers. And as I said, it was sponsored by two Republicans in leadership. It was co-sponsored by several Democrats who were in significant roles in the Democratic caucus. Broad bipartisan support. As we are coming into the special session, really the Thursday before, the governor hosts a press conference and essentially announces the HOPE program, which sort of took some of the sting out of House Bill 1200, and we'll talk about where the fault lines are here. Because what the governor announced was essentially $117 million in rental and utility assistance through the HOPE program. What was missing in that is the mortgage assistance and the supports for housing counseling agencies and legal service providers, right? So in the early days, again, it was the folks who are renting, that was the most immediate need, and continues to be an immediate need, right? But there are things that we had learned from the foreclosure crisis, and some of the forbearance options that were made available meant that assisting most of the folks who have some kind of federally backed mortgage, that forbearance protection covered the vast majority of mortgage holders, not all, but the vast majority. And so, but as we are approaching sort of that cliff of the end of forbearance, we're going to need to address all of those folks who hold mortgages. And we saw in the early days of the HOPE program, it opened, I believe, on a Thursday afternoon, and by Monday morning, they had 11,000 applications, 3,000 or 4,000 of whom were ineligible because they had a mortgage and they weren't renters. So what we are looking, and you'll see this toward the end, as we come into the legislative session, we're working with folks to think about what we can do as a state on the mortgage front. And I'll go ahead and talk about this now instead of waiting for the slide later on. For those of you who have been in North Carolina a while and remember the Pilotex plant closure back in 2002, 2003, and what that sparked off, one of the things that was created in North Carolina was this foreclosure prevention fund, right? And so in 2002, 2003, we had created an infrastructure in the state to be able to, an infrastructure of housing counselors, of a system of payments through the finance agency, to be able to assist folks who, because of this incredible scale of job loss, couldn't pay their mortgages anymore. So when the foreclosure crisis hits, that infrastructure is already in place, right? And so we have housing counseling agencies who are ready to respond immediately, who are doing some of the on the ground work to be able to help folks do loan modifications, all of that type of work. That infrastructure has largely disappeared. There's a lot of reasons for that I don't want to go into now, but one of the things that we are looking at the moment is a very strong need to be able to reactivate that infrastructure. The underlying legislation still exists, so the authority to do it still exists. We just need resources flowing through that system so agencies can begin to staff up in preparation for what we see coming down the pike. So once the governor had announced the HOPE program, the next week on the floor of the House, several people mentioned on the floor, there's no point in doing this, the governor's done it, let's move on and do other things. So when the General Assembly appropriated the remaining relief funding, there was no additional housing support beyond the HOPE program. The other little thing, and this is a consequence of the lack of a 2-year budget, unlike in the federal government where we have government shutdowns, on the state side, legislation was passed, I think 4 years ago, that basically says if we don't pass a budget by the end of the fiscal year when we need to, we just revert to all the recurring expenses of the last 2-year budget that we passed. So we don't shut down. We just there are expenses that we've designated as recurring and non-recurring. In the housing world, the Housing Trust Fund is a recurring expense. The home match, that's a recurring expense. But the Workforce Housing Loan Program, which is this pot of money that helps, comes alongside the low-income housing tax credit, is a non-recurring expense. And so the consequence was that flowed through to help us get more units built, wasn't there. And so one of the other little things that happened that we were a part of was making sure that the Workforce Housing Loan Program was funded, which resulted in an additional, I believe, 500 to 600 units that year. Go ahead and flip the slides. So the HOPE program, you can see 42,000 households and it opened on October 15th and closed on November 11th. Right. It went quick, and I'll say from a well, just it went quick. Right. The resources were not sufficient to meet the need. We can go on. I want to make sure we get to the end. You can flip this. There we go. So year-end omnibus package in DC included an additional $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, which includes $700 million to North Carolina. This is a significant amount of money. For what we're hearing from our national partners is, even though it seems like a significant amount, it's probably going to get folks current to February. And so, you know, again, there's going to be greater need, and there's still a question of how this money is going to flow in North Carolina. The Treasury Department, where the money's coming through, had issued guidance. The guidance was a mess. It was not helpful. And so at the moment, states all over the country are waiting on Treasury to issue new guidance, which we're expecting to come possibly this week. So there's a question of whether that money is going to flow through the HOPE program infrastructure. If it does, there's going to need to be some tweaks to the HOPE program because of the difference in the way that the legislation allows for this money to go out. And it will also require General Assembly action. There was a state Supreme Court case that Cooper v. Berger that governs block grant money and who has the power. Does the General Assembly appropriate it, or can the governor just allocate it? Because state agencies apply to it directly from the federal government, and the Supreme Court came down and saying no, the General Assembly has to allocate. So there's a question of whether we're going to need General Assembly action before we can start pushing that money out. One of the other things that happened that was really important is it pushed the CARES Act spending deadline out to September. This was a big deal. Before it had to get spent by the end of the calendar year, and that was going to be a big ask for a lot of states. The other little thing that happened, and this is something that we have been working on for years, really ever since I've been at the coalition, is fixing the 4% rate for the low-income housing tax credit. For folks who don't do tax credits, I'm not going to get into the weeds on the difference between the 9% and the 4%. What I will say is the 9% side on the low-income housing tax credit, we are oversubscribed. We have about 5 applications for every award in the state of North Carolina, which means if we had more resources, we've got essentially shovel-ready projects ready to go. Where we had room to grow, given the current how resources are currently allocated, was in our 4% on the bond side. And we've been working this for a while. So we set the 4% rate, and we just got, I think last week, the preliminary applications for this year's tax credit round came through, and we have doubled the number of bond applications, which is going to double the amount of units on that side. That is a big win for the state of North Carolina, fixing that rate. So it's a small, super technical tax thing that happened, but it's going to have a big impact. Go ahead and flip slides. Yeah, I've talked about this. Recent presidential action, some of this around this, we expect some action around fair housing stuff, racial equity piece, which is the Biden administration is talking about quite a bit. The only other thing I want to mention in here that is pretty significant is this increase in the FEMA reimbursement for non-congregate sheltering from 75 to 100%. That is also a big deal. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. So the legislative session we got coming up, you see some numbers in here. Here's the thing, we didn't get a budget for the last 2 years. And November saw some significant shifts in DC, at the president, in Congress, all of that, right? It did not see significant shifts in the state of North Carolina. We still have a Democratic governor. We still have Republican control of both chambers of the General Assembly. And while in the early wee hours of 2021, you know, our leaders, Senator Berger, Speaker Moore, and Governor Cooper were talking about a desire to work with one another. A lot of us who do this work are expecting that we're going to see a contentious session again. And there's a question of whether we're going to even go through a 2-year budgeting process at all, or just start passing individual spending bills. So the prospects of what budgeting is going to look like for the state is up in the air right now, and we're still sort of waiting to see how this General Assembly session begins. But I'll say some of the things that we're looking at is that you see the $60 million for foreclosure prevention and housing counseling. Essentially, we're talking with folks at the moment about keeping the homeownership piece of House Bill 1200 that had all that bipartisan support, because we know that there is the folks who aren't covered by the forbearance protections for federally backed mortgages, they're already in crisis. Our housing counseling agencies are already seeing those folks. And then once this forbearance runs out, if there are no added resources for homeowners, we're going to see a wave of foreclosures. And the proposal the proposal for an updated relief bill doesn't have any money in it for homeownership. So that's something that we're looking at, and also the housing counseling piece. I'll say particularly for Eastern North Carolina, the housing counseling capacity in Eastern North Carolina has been particularly weakened over the last several years. And I think there's a need to make sure that that infrastructure is as strong as it can be coming into what we expect to see. We're working on getting the workforce housing loan program up to $35 million, which is the 10-year average of the state housing tax credit that it replaced back in 2014. We're looking to get the housing trust fund up to what it was founded at, which is $20 million. The home match, $3 million. It's happened essentially automatically. And continue to push there was a couple of years ago, the community development block grant money that the state gets was shifted away from commerce and housing over to the Department of Environmental Quality, and begin to get some of that back for housing. And then finally, Governor Cooper announced that he is looking to put a housing bond on the ballot for $500 million back in October. We think that is an excellent idea, and is critical to the housing infrastructure of the state. And so we're going to be working with folks at the General Assembly to try and support putting that on the ballot coming into November. The last thing, and that's the last slide, but the other thing that I want to say, and is that in November we had 2 affordable housing bonds on the ballot in communities around the state. One in Raleigh for $80 million and one in Charlotte for $50 million. Both of them passed. This is big news. I'm going to put in the chat box a link to a blog where we kind of lay out what those what they're intended for, so that you can take a look at that. But I will say we have had successful bond issues for affordable housing in local communities around the state for the last several years, none of which has passed with less than 63% of the vote. It has been a wildly popular thing. And we know that there are a number of communities considering one in November this year, including Fayetteville. So yeah, I don't want to take up any more time, so I'm gonna stop there and let us transition to what we're doing next. If we're doing questions or moving on to Cindy.
Okay, thank you, Samuel. And if I remember right, maybe in the near future, we might look to your coalition for some county-specific information on, in 2020, what is the updated affordable housing outlook in Brunswick County, in New Hanover County, in
Normally
Pender
we
County.
have that done by now, but given the pandemic, the numbers that we would normally see, they're already a little bit dated by the time we create them. And given the pandemic, we wanted to get search for different data, as we're all trying to get a handle on, especially those who are designing programs and targeted support, so that they could do that better. But
Right.
as soon as we got them, you'll get them.
Understood. And we've appreciated that tool in the past, and we look forward to it down the road. So thank you again. A couple of notes before our next speaker. I want to acknowledge that Chase Horton has joined us. Chase is representing Senator Michael Lee. So Chase, thank you for pointing out to us that you have joined us. I also want to mention she's hidden, but Megan Zielinski of our Continuum of Care is with me here, and she is the behind the scenes doer of all things IT and advancing the slides of our speakers and helping with chat box questions and all that sort of thing. So big thanks to my hidden helper here, Megan. So Cynthia Blue. Cynthia has over 20 years of experience in the financing and development of affordable housing. rehabilitation programs, and housing services. She serves as manager of the Housing Services Division for the City of Greensboro, developing and implementing housing programs responsive to the community's needs. She serves as a resource both to the community organizations that know the needs and the decision makers regarding city priorities and spending. Cynthia will be a key member of the team implementing the new opportunities and focused investment strategies outlined in Housing GSO, Greensboro's 10-year plan for affordable housing. Welcome, Cynthia. Talk again. Hey, Cynthia, you might have to unmute yourself to get started. We can't hear you just yet. But everyone else, please stay muted.
There we go.
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's
Perfect.
better. Sorry about that.
No, all good, all good.
My name is Cynthia Blue, and I am manager of housing services for the city of Greensboro. And we've got a lot of material here to cover, so I'll jump right in. I do want to pick up a little bit, though, on what Samuel was saying and talk just a minute about Greensboro in general. Greensboro was a manufacturing town 15 years ago when the mills were closing one after another. What the jobs that came back were services jobs. Those economic ripples are still coursing through our community. 10 years after that, you had the foreclosure crisis, and those ripples are still ongoing. And so you're going to see in some of the strategies that we present in our plan, ways that we are trying to address some of these longstanding structural issues in our economy and our housing market. In our housing market, what we're seeing right now is a lot of capital being invested in purchasing older rental properties, repositioning them with higher rents. We are seeing luxury market rental development in our downtown area, and we're seeing suburban tract housing, neither of which do much for the low income and affordable housing that is so critically needed in our community. If you want to go to the next slide. I know that our mayor spoke to you last year about Greensboro's $25 million housing bond. This was passed by voter referendum in 2016. Those bonds had 9 different project categories in them. We had overall production goals of about 1,000 units, 1,007 units, and we anticipated leveraging about $54 million. At this point in January, we're about halfway through the spending of those bonds. We've expended or committed about 13 million of them. And to date, we've actually done over 1,100 units and leveraged over $73 million. So we are really cracking on this, and we're really proud of our accomplishments. We're looking forward to the repositioning of those bond dollars to match up with the goals and strategies that are outlined in our plan, and to really getting into that implementation piece of this new plan. You could go to the next slide, please. Okay, and next slide. So we had spent the better part of the year before the bonds were passed focused in community discussions around housing. So interest was high, participation was high. We contracted with HR&A advisors, so I've got to give props to them for the plan and this slide production. They have also worked with the city of Raleigh and with Wake County and with the city of Charlotte and some others in North Carolina. And so they've got a really good feel for what's going on in North Carolina and North Carolina communities. Next slide, please. Go, keep going. Thank you. Our plan has 4 primary housing goals. The first being affordable rental homes, the second being neighborhood reinvestment, the third, access to home ownership, and the fourth, supportive housing. These are the goal areas where we have outlined our strategies and where we're going to be focusing not only our bond dollars, but our federal dollars and the other partner resources that are going to be coming in to create the opportunities in this plan. If you can go to the next slide. Just before we were ready to take the plan to our city council for adoption is when COVID hit last year, and pretty much derailed everything for a short period of time as we scrambled to get emergency dollars out the door. We set up rental assistance programs, mortgage assistance programs, getting folks into shelters and off the streets and into hotels. It was a pretty wild ride there for a little bit, but we did get the plan adopted later in the year, and we're now ready to step into some of these implementation areas. If you could go to the next slide. And so affordable rental homes, go ahead. I want to talk just for a minute about some of the needs behind this category and then what it is we're actually doing in this category. This slide shows that while median renter incomes are increasing in Greensboro, it's those folks who don't have a bachelor's degree, those lower income folks, those service sector jobs, those are the ones who are down there at the bottom whose incomes have risen only 2%, while rents have risen at 5%. And so it's those lower income households that are really being challenged by the rising rent levels in Greensboro. Go ahead. And this just points out some of those types of job categories that do fall in that lower income band. The median income in Greensboro is $66,600. So folks who are earning incomes below $30,000 are below 50% of our median income. And over the last 8 or 9 years, 40% of our total job growth has been in those income categories. And almost half of those households in that income category have children in them. So there's a significant number of households and new households who are in these lower income bands that are going to be struggling as rents and housing costs increase. Go ahead. And here's where we get into what the gaps are. And this is, I want to be clear that this is not a gap in physical units necessarily, it's a gap in the affordability of units. So right now in 2020, we're looking at an affordability gap of about 4,000 households. If we did nothing through 2030, we would be looking at a gap of 11,000 in affordable units for households at those lower income levels. Go ahead to the next slide. So strategies that have been developed around affordable housing. The first is working through our 9% low-income housing tax credit projects to create more affordability within those projects by providing additional subsidy, which helps to offset bank debt and bring down those rents. We are looking at all public lands. Are they suitable for housing? Is there a way that we can get them out there and get more housing into production on resources that we own, as well as our partner government agencies such as the county and other government-owned land within the city of Greensboro. We are also working with the Greensboro Housing Authority, which has been in a long-term process to convert all of their units from public housing units to basically private units with project-based rental assistance. And they have one remaining large development to be completely redeveloped, and that's the Smith Homes development. That's about 430 units. So that's a major project to be done within the next 5 years. We are also, as Samuel talked about, looking at ways to subsidize those 4% low-income housing tax credit deals. This is a real challenge for us. We haven't really figured this one out. For those of you who don't know much about the tax credit world, the 9% low-income housing tax credits generally provide about 70% of a project's development cost in the form of equity. So that allows much lower bank debt, much lower rents. The 4% low-income housing tax credits provide only about 25 to 30% of a project's total cost in equity. So it requires much higher bank debt, generally much higher rents. These deals work really well in areas like Charlotte and Raleigh and Wake County. They're more of a struggle in Greensboro unless you're willing to put a very large amount of subsidy into it. And so that's a piece that we are still working on. It's a goal, but that's going to take some work or some large pockets of additional financing. And the last is establishing a housing preservation fund where we would be working with philanthropic sources, lending sources, and government sources to put together a nimble pool of capital that can go out and acquire properties, preserve them as affordable housing so that we're not losing as many housing units from the affordable housing stock. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk just a minute about neighborhood reinvestment as a goal, and want to start off first by saying what neighborhood reinvestment is not. This is not classic redevelopment. This is not going into highly distressed or highly blighted areas and redeveloping them. This is going into what some of you may be familiar with Alan Malick's terminology of middle neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where there is existing quality housing stock. It may be a little bit older. It may need some renovation. You may have older homeowners who may be aging out. There may be reasons why these neighborhoods could potentially tip into distress, and this is an effort to prevent that. So we have identified 5 neighborhoods in Greensboro. All of them are very different characteristics about them. They're going to require very different intervention efforts and very strong partnerships. Some of the things that we looked at when we were considering neighborhoods was, is there strong neighborhood leadership? Is there civic engagement within that community and an interest in revitalizing and preserving that community? Is there already market activity? Are these neighborhoods where houses can sell at a market value? Is there a decent quality of housing stock that may need some repairs, it may need some renovation, but it's not to the level where a neighborhood would be considered distressed? And are there neighborhood amenities and investment or catalytic investments that are going on that we can help by leveraging and taking advantage of those investments? Next slide, please. This is just an example from the plan of what a sample neighborhood in reinvestment strategy might look like if you had 1,500 housing units. Generally, to stabilize a neighborhood, you'd want to be reaching out to 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 of those housing units over that 5-year period. So you're looking at about 125 housing units, and these are not necessarily the categories that would be required by a neighborhood. Every neighborhood would be different, but it was a way to show people the possibilities of what could be done in a neighborhood to bring it back and make it marketable for the long term. Next slide, please. So some of the activities that we would carry out in this area is strongly partnering with those neighborhoods, sitting down with that neighborhood leadership and the neighborhood residents and finding out what their true needs are and what their interests are. Implementing community partnerships and bringing in resources, not just from our division and our department, but other city departments and other agencies and outside agencies that can help support what's going on in those neighborhoods. We would specialize most likely in supporting the rehabilitation and infill development work through our normal channels of rehab and development, but also we have code compliance within our department, and we see code compliance as a very vital tool to identifying issues and bringing resources to that landlord section of the ownership market in those neighborhoods. We are working right now on consolidating our rehabilitation programs and refocusing them so that they are going to be the best tools that we can use in these areas. And again, that public land disposition, if we own land in these neighborhoods, if the school system owns lands in these neighborhoods or the county, what are the areas of opportunity that we have to create more housing in these neighborhoods? Go ahead. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about home ownership. Our home ownership program has been going gangbusters in Greensboro. We have done, I believe it's 700 first-time homebuyer loans with the housing bond money plus additional loans with federal dollars. Go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about why that is so important to us here in Greensboro. The upper income bands in Greensboro have held their homeownership status fairly well, even down to the median income folks. The median income for Greensboro is $66,000, so that we're right in the middle of that 50K to 75K band there, and that's holding its own. It's those lower income homeownership bands that have lost homeownership, and that's really a hangover from the foreclosure crisis. So we want to be particularly careful to target those income bands and make sure that we are supporting those owners, not just to get into housing, but to stay into housing. Next slide, please. So the two key strategies that we're looking at here are to modify our down payment assistance program so that it more clearly targets those lower income bands and those geographic areas that we've outlined for additional homeownership support. And we also want to make sure that those services that we put out and those loans that we make have the support that goes along, such as delinquency counseling and budget counseling and foreclosure intervention, to make sure that these homeowners remain homeowners for the long term. Next slide, please. Supportive housing is going to be very key to our recovery from this COVID situation. We are actively looking for ways to create more supportive units on the ground, as well as to insert more supportive housing into the housing that we are developing. One of the key issues that we need to work on is the supportive services structure, because if we create the units and we put people in those units, there's got to be that case management to keep them housed. And that's a system that still needs some work and some refining in Greensboro. Just a quick note about evictions in Greensboro. Greensboro has had one of the highest eviction rates of large cities in North Carolina, and we landed on one of those lists that hit the news waves of being the 7th highest eviction rate in the country. So there are reasons for that. There is lack of legal support for tenants in the eviction process. And so those are all situations that we are needing to work on, because that's a key driver in increasing our homeless rate. We have close to 600 homeless individuals at any given time. We need to reduce the inflow in order to be able to bring those numbers down. Go ahead. So strategies that we are using to increase our supportive housing include dedicating funding and focusing on housing first, making sure that our programs are low barrier programs and that people are able to get access into housing. There aren't structural reasons for people not being able to access housing. We are going to be constructing more supportive units, both through the 9% tax credit project and other available sources, such as CFHC's Supportive Housing Development Program. We work with the COC, the Continuum of Care in Guilford County. We have one county and 2 cities all working together in one continuum of care. Can be contentious at times, but we're all working together to make sure that the emphasis stays on housing first, and that we have an adequate system of identifying who is homeless, what are their needs, who is highest acuity, and that we have those units ready for people to move into. And again, through COVID, we are learning lots and lots about short-term rental assistance. We put out a great deal of money, about a little over $2 million, I believe, in rental assistance and mortgage assistance through local agencies. We also were just notified by the Treasury Department that we have $9 million coming to us under the new stimulus package. So we are going to have to learn how to ramp that capacity up quickly in the next few months in order to make sure that the dollars are getting to those folks in the community that really need them. Next slide. Okay, I'm just going to talk just a few minutes about implementation and the directions we're going in implementation. these are some of the areas that the city really needs to focus on for implementation to be successful. We have got to identify additional dollars. The remaining bond dollars that we have, about $12 million left, plus our federal funding, is not going to be enough to really affect the changes we want to see in this plan. We have estimated an additional $50 million needed over the next 10 years. Our mayor is on board with supporting an additional bond referendum, so we are looking forward to that campaign starting off potentially this year. And was really excited to hear about Samuel's comments about perhaps a state housing bond and what that might provide for additional funding out there. We also need to work very closely with all of the private and philanthropic partners here in Greensboro to raise additional dollars. We do have strong interest from the banking community in the preservation fund, and we're working right now to put that focus group together so that we can get that plan in place and get that up and running. We will be working both within city government, across departments, but also outside city government with their other governmental partners on looking for available resources and perhaps non-traditional way of using government resources. We need to keep our community informed of what we're doing and how we're doing and the successes. We haven't had a history of making big to-dos over our successes, but we need to in order to help people understand what's going on and why it's important. And that why is this last comment about community education and awareness. There are some communities that do a really good job with this. We have not dedicated the resources really around an awareness campaign before, so that's going to be new for us, and really making sure that people know why it's so critical that we do these activities that are outlined in the plan. So with that, I think I've hit about the end. Oh, no, there's one more here. So these are the various public-private working groups that we are going to be putting together. The first one that we're working on right now is establishing the Housing Preservation Fund, where we are working with lenders and philanthropic organizations and the development community to create the capital pool and the rules and processes that will go along with a pool of capital that can go out and acquire properties, rehab them, and keep them in the affordable housing stock. We are also working right now on our request for proposals for the low-income housing tax credit projects and our ability to subsidize those 4% LIHTC deals. We do have one 4% LIHTC deal in this current application round with NCHFA, so we're taking a look at that. We're going to be working with neighborhoods, and through our COVID processes, we are learning a lot about short-term rental assistance, and we will be also designing a community education and awareness campaign to go along with what we're doing in all the other areas. Oops. There we go. And this slide is again just talking about community education and awareness and what we need to do to make sure that the community understands the importance of housing and is vested in the investments that we are making in affordable housing. When we first started back with the bond campaign, we had a lot of negativity around it in Greensboro. Some of the conservative media said that government shouldn't be in housing. It's not a house. It's not a city government service. Well, I think that understanding and that attitude has changed somewhat in the intervening years, given the level of importance that housing has had in the national conversations and the local conversations. So we're excited about building on that change of heart and to really get people to champion the need for affordable housing in Greensboro. Right. And that is all from my end. So I think Samuel and I will be happy to entertain questions and give as much information and resources as we can. I believe that the the Cape Fear Housing Coalition, we posted the link to our 10-year plan, correct?
We did, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, I think several folks had an opportunity to look at it before today, so they already had some questions formed before we convened this morning. So thank you, Cynthia, and we have had a flurry of great questions come in. We would like to ask Cynthia and Samuel to field those between now and about 9:55 when we'll close. So we'll see how many we get to, and then there may very well be a few remaining, and we may kind of circle back out to Cynthia and Samuel, maybe for emailed responses that we then circulate to everyone. So we'll make sure we make an effort to have everyone's questions answered. Samuel, Cynthia just referenced again the potential $500 million state housing bond that you referenced in your presentation for a community like the Cape Fear region. If that were to happen, what could our community potentially expect to come of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean the only answer is I don't know.
Oh, come on, you could do better than that.
No, but I'll say that Cooper announced that his desire for a $500 million affordable housing bond the day before the short session and before November, right? So there's I think the political prospects of getting that on the ballot it's going to be an uphill climb. But that was the stated desire back in October. And, I'll say from doing this work here at the coalition for the last 5 years that we struggle every year to around the state housing trust fund. And you talk about local bond measures, Raleigh approving 80 million, Charlotte 50, 25 in Bunka, on down the line, right? And our statewide trust fund is just above $7.5 million for the whole state, right? In terms of scale, it's not much. But we have some pretty profound housing needs from an infrastructure standpoint, right? And we see this play out. For those of you who work on the homelessness side of the spectrum, that whether or not you've got or from the housing choice voucher side, from the public housing authority side, you may have a voucher, but you can't find places to put people, right? There's a stock challenge. What we see in a lot of our rural communities, although it's not isolated only to rural, it's a problem in urban areas as well, is a question of rehabilitation, right? There's a lot of housing stock that is aging, a lot of manufactured housing stock that is outliving its usability, and there's some profound challenges that we're going to and getting a resource at that kind of scale allows us to think holistically about that as a piece of our infrastructure. So what Wilmington could see, I don't know. We have staff from Senator Lee's office here, and I'm sure that he would be instrumental in anything along those lines. I'll say that one of the challenges for us from a political standpoint in the General Assembly the last couple of years has been we have broad bipartisan support in the House. But one of the dynamics that we see play out in the General Assembly is there's a perception that housing is really a big city issue. And so not in November, but the previous election cycle, there were a number of Republican senators who lost their reelection campaigns. Senator Tart from Mecklenburg County, Senator Lee from Wilmington, Senator Behringer from Wake County. There were several urban Republicans who lost their seats, and it meant that the Senate Republican caucus got a lot more rural, and it became really difficult to navigate that. We've seen that shift. Senator Lee's back. And Senator Alexander from Wake County is so we're hoping to see some voices in the Senate that'll help us navigate that dynamic.
That's helpful context. Thank you. Cynthia, thinking about how your community went from kind of a place of no around a housing bond to eventually passing one, I think for our community, you know, we often kind of feel like, well, we're not a Raleigh, we're not a Charlotte, we're not Guilford County or Greensboro. It's kind of humbling to hear that we're behind even Fayetteville in very seriously looking at and planning for a housing bond. That's tough to hear, that we are that far behind so many of our peers in North Carolina. How did your community get from that place of no to widespread support for a housing bond? And for example, did your Chamber of Commerce play a role in that?
Yes, it was a very intentional campaign, and there were 4 separate bonds on that referendum. There was transportation, parks and rec, economic development, and housing. And instead of having interest groups pick off and support one bond versus another bond, the intention on all parties was to promote all 4 bonds equally, that it was a package, all 4 of them together. The housing bond was the weakest one at the end of the day in terms of voter support, but it did pass. And I think it was in great measure due to the committed advocacy groups that we have in Greensboro around housing, but also the fact that the bonds were promoted together instead of singly.
I'll add on that. When Charlotte put their first $50 million, not this last time, but the time before, there was a lot of sort of vocal, outspoken opposition that ended up not translating to the ballot box, right? I think with a lot of local issues, there's a, polling. They're not doing the same type of polling they're doing in national races, right? So it's, you kind of bite your nails a little bit more than you normally would for other races on election night. But one of the things that Charlotte did in particular was it's part of a series over several years of plan for the local infrastructure. Housing is a piece of that, parks is a piece of that, transportation is a piece of that. And so I think telling a story not only to elected officials and to your Chamber of Commerce folks, but to your voters more broadly, that this is a part of how we see ourselves as a community, and we want to be a community where everyone has a home is an important thing, and to be able to accomplish that, here's how we're going to get there. And I'll say that a lot of the opposition was from sort of folks who are in some key elected officials, but once the issue got in front of the people, it was a widely popular yes, right? Which is something we generally see around housing. Folks support housing policies when they're given a choice.
Yeah, and I do think that if our mayor does move and council move forward with an additional bond referendum this year, the fact that we have a plan outlined that we can point to and say, this is what we are going to do, and this is how we are going to use these funds, is going to be really helpful for us this time around. We had a lot of community conversation, a lot of community interest the last time. We didn't have a specific plan that we could point to and say, this is what the outcome is going to be.
Great, that's all encouraging and helpful. So
I'll also add, and this is, this may or may not be helpful, but folks support come to this for a lot of different reasons, right? I mean, folks are in different places on why would they support something like this, right? But I'll say that for all the noble reasons and the ignoble reasons, all of that, I've gotten half of my co-sponsors on a bill before solely on the fact that South Carolina has this and North Carolina doesn't. So, if folks are motivated by that, you go.
We'll totally take that. We might lead with that, Samuel. So Samuel or Cynthia, ours is, speaking of the things we don't have yet that we're working toward, ours is not a community yet that has a dedicated housing trust fund or housing impact fund. What are your thoughts, for example, on the Charlotte example of, purchasing naturally occurring affordable housing to preserve it? Cynthia and Samuel, I think you both talked about the need to preserve affordable housing, not just produce new units. And what examples have you seen or have you experienced in terms of working with the private sector perhaps to make that happen? I think we're making some baby steps here in that area, but we don't really have a critical, mass of that happening just yet.
Yeah, that is one of our key priorities, and it's actually one of the very first things that we are working on right now is that creation of the lending pool for a preservation fund and how we put that together and what requirements we put around that and how long does it have to remain affordable. All of those questions we're going to be working through in the next couple of months. The good news is that there is a lot of interest out there in the banking community in being associated with things like this. So a lot of the big banks are putting together affordable housing divisions or foundations or funding pots. So being able to tap into that interest and channel it into affordable housing is fantastic.
I keep thinking it's helpful for us that you're a few steps ahead of us so we can keep learning. We can keep learning from you all as we formulate our own plan. This is kind of genius on our part to be a little bit behind you.
I think one thing that's important to note for North Carolina, whenever affordable housing conversations pop up, and I think we've talked about this at the legislative breakfast in years past, inclusionary zoning is where a lot of people want to go, right? And there's a legal question about whether or not we can have anything like mandatory inclusionary zoning in North Carolina. Setting that aside, so folks get a block there, right? That, well, if we don't think we can do this, that's it. Our big tool is off the table. The reality is local governments in North Carolina have a huge amount of power around affordable housing, more so than they have power around anything else, right? The legal authority that a local government has to engage in activity specifically around affordable housing is greater than you have around economic development. You can do more to build and incentivize affordable housing than you can to bring a company to your right. So there is a lot of power that local governments have, including, having property, conveying it, picking your development, things like that. When it's around affordable housing, you have a broad grant of authority in North Carolina statute. And I think that exploring that. So when you talk about the ability to obtain and preserve, and local government has a number of tools in their toolbox that I think we're still sort of figuring out what the full extent of that is. Local governments are still trying to figure out how best to leverage that authority.
Right, understood. Thank you. Cynthia, you referenced in talking about supportive housing, so housing that is not only affordable and costs no more than 30% of someone's income, let's say, as their rent, married with case management, as you referenced. You spoke specifically to housing first, and there's a lot of confusion around that sort of best practice philosophy. So, I mean, it requires things or it includes things like not requiring income, let's say, of the residents. Is that right? And what other elements of housing first are you all looking to support?
We have made, from the city's perspective, we have made a conscious choice to support housing first as the evidence-based best practice. That it's the concept of getting folks into housing and then working on the rest of the issues that may be presenting barriers to their success. And so the real critical piece for us is we can build the units, but without a dedicated and coordinated supportive services stream for case management, folks who get placed in those units are not going to be long-term successful. And that's going to require making sure that we have the right partnerships in place with our supportive service providers, but also that we're working with the Department of Health and Human Services, because they provide the referrals for the key rent units for supportive housing in the low-income housing tax credit projects. And in the last two projects that we built, we didn't get referrals. And so here we have built these units, but without referrals, the developers after 90 days are able to offer those units to anyone. So making sure that those units get filled with the appropriate people, and then making sure that the supportive services from the local community are in place to make sure that those folks are successful in their housing.
Perfect. Thank you for
I'll say from abroad, just, you know, whenever housing first comes up, and I'll say this as a minister, right? I'm a Baptist minister, so I work with committees. I've been working with committees a lot, and I have very vivid memory of working at a church and chairing a missions committee meeting. And one of our missions partners, who's a homeless service provider, and this is in Texas, was talking about this project, and he was talking about housing first, and remember very vividly two of the people kind of shocked at what he was describing. So you're telling me that if they have a drink, they still get to have housing? It's like, yes, that is what I'm telling you. And so I think that there's a lot of like confusion over what housing first is, but it's basically this. Housing is a critical human need, right? And any kind of barrier you're putting between folks and accessing housing is working against anything that we're trying to do, right? It is unhelpful. And especially in the midst of a global pandemic, right? And we're seeing how critical it is to have a secure, safe, healthy place to be able to shelter, not just for you as a person, but for the public health, right? That it is a public health need. That decreasing barriers as much as possible for folks to access housing, because once that housing is secure, you can begin to work on everything else, right? But that until that housing is secure, it doesn't make a lot of sense to work on whatever it is, addiction issues, whatever, name your problem. You can't do that when you're not housed. And so that has to come first. And I think that getting it in folks' minds, because we come at this from a scarcity mindset. There's only so many of these things, and so we got to make sure that the folks who get it are the ones who deserve it, right? And we need to, especially for folks who care about housing and frankly who care about their communities, you gotta scrap all of that architecture in your head. That what we're talking about is an individual who deserves or doesn't deserve something. And you need to start thinking about it from a community standpoint. What kind of housing infrastructure are we building so that all the people in our community are able to live here and thrive here? And to sort of bring this to the, you know, even this program we have, which is the Workforce Housing Loan Program, we get a lot of talk, and I talk to a lot of local governments, a lot of mayors groups, a lot of city council groups about, well, what we really want is workforce housing, right? The reality is it's all workforce housing because there's no one out there, frankly, who isn't working. I mean, unless you are like getting some kind of disability check, you are working in some way, shape, or form. And those jobs are clearly needed. And if you can't afford to live in your community, working the jobs that community needs, there's a problem there. And so, again, we need to scrap this kind of scarcity mindset and deserving mindset, because this is a basic human need, and not having it for part of your community is a problem for the whole community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking to that. I'm going to carry around a tape of this conversation every day with me. Cynthia, you know, thinking about Greensboro, how I think a struggle in all of our communities as we talk about revitalizing neighborhoods is, how do you revitalize it for the benefit of the people who have lived there for so long, and sort of hold off the dynamics that might create a situation where they, as a completely unintended result, end up feeling pushed out and priced out? How do you strike a balance, or is that something that you all are still struggling with? And someone who knows Greensboro well is giving the example of Revolution Mill. You have some former and current Greensboro folks on the call today.
Yes, and Revolution Mill is a catalyst project right on the border of that Mill District neighborhood that we had identified. Self-help credit union and their associated companies have pumped, I think it's about $200 million into that project. It's a stunning transformation. And just a couple of blocks away is a 4% tax credit deal that we participated in at Printworks Mill that has created 217 units and is just coming online now. So those are huge catalytic investments in that neighborhood that is surrounded by some lower income and older neighborhoods. The Mill District was a lot of the old mill housing that was built by the cone industries as worker housing. And so it's also a historic district. And so there's a whole lot of complex issues within that neighborhood when you go in and start to look at how can we make this neighborhood sustainable for the long term, and sustainable both for new people who want to come in, but also sustainable for the folks who are living there now, many of whom are older homeowners. We're watching what's going on in places like Durham, which has seen such dramatic growth and changes in some of its core areas. We have not seen that level of investment and market run up in prices. We just haven't had that level of explosive growth in Greensboro. We've got very sort of slow growth going on, but we're watching what's happening in other places and looking at ways that we can make sure what we do doesn't trigger in any way some kind of a run up like that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Samuel, for those who maybe are not quite as familiar with some of the lingo, could you explain the difference between balance of state CDBG or community development block grant funds and entitlement cities? You know, we have, for example, locally, we have the city of Wilmington and we have New Hanover County. So can you explain the difference for those who may not be aware of the differences and who gets funds and how from the state?
Yeah, so I mean, the real quick and simple answer is community development block grant is one of several things that's allocated by population. So census, really important thing, because it determines where resources flow. We have 28 entitlement districts, I believe, designated in North Carolina, which are our bigger communities, counties, local cities, so on and so forth. They get their own pot of money directly from the federal government. They get to decide what to do with it. And then for everyone else who is in a non-entitlement district, that money goes to the state. For CDBG, it's about $42 million, give or take, every year that they then distribute around. For years, that went to Commerce. It was part of that was rural rehab money and some other things. Then in, I believe, 2013, responding to a crisis really in rural water infrastructure, right? The General Assembly decided to shift all of that money over to the DENR, now the Department of Environmental Quality, to do water infrastructure projects. We were successful in getting some of that money back to Commerce, but for y'all, it's the non-entitlement stuff that doesn't really impact y'all as much.
All right, thank you. I'm going to make good on my threat and perhaps circle back to the two of you with a few remaining questions that we didn't have time to get to. Before we close, I wonder if we could ask both of you, Samuel and Cynthia, for a community like ours, which has maybe we're at a point of sort of readiness to move forward and achieve some concrete gains around affordable housing. For example, we have a comprehensive housing study about to come out for New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington, and that might be a great sort of launch pad for some initiatives. But for a community that doesn't have a bond yet, doesn't have a housing trust fund yet, feels like we're hopefully on the verge of good things, but still has so much work to do. Just a few sentences of what you might offer us in terms of encouragement or inspiration as we go back to the tough work of advocating for affordable housing.
Yeah, I'll say that 2020 was a really challenging year for many of us on many fronts, right? With little kids and in the house and loss of daycare, trying to do a job with 2-year-old twins climbing all over. I mean, it was a rough year. But here's the thing. I think something that shook loose in 2020 was this sense that all of these, the way that things are has to be the way that they are. I think it gave a lot of us, some in positive ways, some in not so positive ways, a realization that, oh man, it could be different, right? That all the things that we think are insurmountable are not actually insurmountable. And I'll say that one of the examples that I'll give is when we were in the General Assembly in the early days talking about House Bill 1200. We were talking with a couple of Democratic elected officials to say, all right, we spent an hour on here's how it's going to be structured, here's how we think the money should flow, here's how we, and then we get to the part of the conversation where we're talking about, all right, how much money are we talking about? What's the scale of the need? And one of the elected officials, their first offering was, well, 5 million. I think that's what we can maybe get out of this General Assembly. And there was a moment of silence, like, oh my gosh, we're like, our horizon of imagination, of possibilities has been so limited, right? And over the course of 5 minutes, that went from 5 to 200 million. And when we brought that to Republican House leadership, no one blinked an eye at that, right? And so I think that that's a tiny thing, but more broadly, that I think the sense that we're stuck with what we've got and the dynamics that we've always experienced, but there's this chance for us to see the community that we actually want to be and put our energy and our resources behind becoming that instead of letting what we've been before hold us back.
Yeah, going off of what Samuel said, I think that this past year, people who were housed realized just how thankful they were that they were housed. And I think that sense of thankfulness can translate into compassion and into action. We had to very quickly last year get our homeless folks off the streets and into first a congregate center at the Sportsplex, which was at best a stopgap measure, but then getting them into hotels and getting them transitioned out of hotels and into permanent housing. And people saw that going on at the same time that everything else was going on, and they thought, oh my goodness, this is so visible, this is so real, but look, it's achievable. And I think that those sentiments are very helpful in terms of making the argument of how necessary it is.
Thank you. Samuel, Gunter, and Cynthia Blue, you have both been absolutely wonderful. We could not thank you enough. I know we have y'all muted, but if you could clap or give a thumbs up and join me in thanking these two for being so generous with their time and their expertise. We are just so, so grateful to both of you. You've given us a lot to consider, including concrete ideas for our own housing plans throughout the region, not just in one city or county, and including, I hope, housing bonds for some of those communities. We want to thank the sponsors of today's event, Jody Wainio of Buyer's Choice Realty, Leaf HR Group, WARM, Cape Fear Habitat for Humanity, the City of Wilmington, New Hanover County, and Good Shepherd Center. Again, we encourage you to stay connected with the Cape Fear Housing Coalition. A recording of this event today and our other presentations, information on membership, resources, future events, and our monthly meeting schedule can be found at capefearhousingcoalition.org. Please consider joining us as a volunteer, as a member, as someone who just sits in periodically but cares about the access to affordable housing for all of our neighbors in the Cape Fear region. So thank you all. Please be a voice for affordable housing, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you all.